Hi kids, I'm Michael. Welcome back. Happy Juneteenth. Today we're going to be talking about Black movement history, Black leftist politics, and Black liberals. Outside is still pretty hectic, so you might want to grab a pen and pencil for this one, kid. Remember to keep breathing, and let's get moving. There's a quote that's going around that I think is going to be really helpful for today's lesson, kids. It says, normalize changing your opinion when presented with new information. Let's keep that quote in our back pockets as we work through our multiple stories today. As you've probably guessed by now, kids, we're going to be talking about the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement. Not the natural, unalienable rights movement, not the human rights movement, but the civil rights movement. Take a second to think about that, but don't think about it too long because we're coming right back to that much later. A lot of people harken back to the civil rights movement, kids, and as they should. It's one of the most amazing moments in modern world history. And as we talk about the civil rights movement today, kids, we're not just going to talk about the civil rights movement, but we're going to talk about how we talk about and retell the story of the civil rights movement. In other words, we'll be talking about the historiography of the civil rights movement. Unfortunately, kids, one of the most nuanced, forward-pushing, people-led, community-oriented reconfigurations of the nation and the world has been watered down, wackified, and whitewashed. That's 3 W's, but nobody's winning. What are just some of the many characteristics of a wackified version of the civil rights movement? Well, people love superheroes, kids, and they really love superheroes in their movement stories. And the typical civil rights movement story is full of charismatic Black superheroes who are usually, if not always, men. We even literally call them superheroes or our heroes who, in our minds, swoop down and save the day out of literally nowhere. This simplifies a lot of the story, which brings us to our second wackification of the civil rights movement. Even when we do tell the superhero story that wackifies and waters down the civil rights movement, we water down and completely wackify or sanitize these so-called superheroes. And in a global health pandemic and a movement of global protests, the last thing we want to sanitize is history. Some examples of the sanitization of the civil rights movement: only sharing the "I Have a Dream" speech instead of MLK's letter from a Birmingham jail, where he says, "I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice." Or his Beyond Vietnam speech, where he says, "We must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society, when machines and computers, profit motives, and property rights are considered more important than people. The giant triplets of racism, extreme militarism, and materialism are incapable of being conquered." Or when we read the "I Have a Dream" speech, we only focus on one section of a pretty long speech, kids, and skip over the sections where he says things like, "In a sense, we've come to our nation's capital to cash a check. Instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds." We even sanitized the title of the March on Washington. The full title of the March on Washington is the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. There's an economic tie to that. We also paint Martin Luther King as nonviolent in his actual life and not nonviolence as just a political strategy. Martin Luther King applied for a gun license, and he had armed watchmen watching his house, and his house was bombed. There was a lot of violence in the civil rights movement, kids. And the truth is, these civil rights heroes would have been nothing on their own. Wait 1 second, kids. I think we have someone trying to call in. It's one of our teachers for our special segment today called Wait, but what about? Today's guest is from our very own Mr. Know It, Oh, hi, Mr. Know-It-All. Thanks for calling. Wait, but what's your question?
Hey, hey, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, yeah, we can hear you. We can hear you, Mr. Know-It-All.
Oh, okay, yeah. I just wanted to say, wait. But what about MLK? What about MLK? What about MLK?
We 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 we've been talking about MLK, Mr. Know-It-All.
See now. That was a great man. That was a great man. He led those boycotts. See, that's the problem with you kids these days. That's the problem with you kids these days. Y'all couldn't lead a candy shop. Y'all can't do nothing. No leadership. That's the problem. No leadership. Talk about some Black Lives Matter. You know what you need to do. You know what you need.
And that's the end of this week's Wait, But What About, kids? While MLK was a great man, there were a lot of great women who taught these great men and led much of the movement on their own without these men even being present. And these women knew that there didn't always need to be one person leading the movement taking up all of the shine. And that the best parts of movement are led by the collective mass of people who are most impacted by the movement. Which brings us to another wackification of the civil rights movement, focusing on the highlights. When people think of the civil rights movement, they think of generally three images in their head. Rosa Parks protesting bus segregation, young people marching and being sprayed by hoses, and of course, Martin Luther King in the 1963 March on Washington. These moments were important moments in history, but when we focus on the highlights alone, kids, we lose sight of the long, slow, tedious years of works that it takes to politically organize hundreds of thousands of people and imagine new solutions for society. It's like going to a movie or a musical and the credits never playing, or no one acknowledging the orchestra or the stage crew. It's like your one friend on Instagram or TikTok posting their bleached denim jeans and never posting the labor-exploited brown women from across the world who risked chemical toxins and sewed those jeans. The highlight reel version of the civil rights movement leaves out of consideration, or, and here's a really good vocab word, kids, elides all of the people who helped plan ahead, spread the word, cook the food, or collected the bail money for these huge movements of protest to happen, most of which was done by Black women and Black queer women. When we see these highlight images without the backstory, it makes it seem as though these events just happened out of nowhere. It gives an illusion of spontaneity, which elides the months of years of advocating, teaching, volunteering, sacrifice, internal debates, and disagreements, and even death that it took for that perfect moment of resistance to be captured and felt by the rest of America, who generally preferred pretending that everything was fine and ignoring everything beyond their idea of reality. Which brings us to our first story, kids, the 1955 Montgomery bus boycott. Let's start with Rosa Parks, kids. Meet Rosa Parks, not a timid, tired woman sitting on a bus. Rather, a longtime political organizer, trained at the Highlander Center in Tennessee, that focused on training grassroots organizers, member of the NAACP, and member of the Women's Political Council, a Black organization for racial justice and gender equality. Rosa Parks knew what she was doing, and she knew that she wasn't alone. Not only did she have her own political know-how, she had an entire Black community that had been organizing and waiting for a perfect moment like this for decades. The Montgomery bus boycott was all about the details, kids. 35,000 Black people in Montgomery had to be organized in days. No smartphone, no Instagram, no Twitter, no Uber, no Lyft. These people had to be persuaded and accommodated. Black-owned taxi cab companies had to be persuaded to let Black people ride for the cheap. This meant less income to bring home to their families and children. Some Black people just didn't want to interrupt the status quo, kids. Then white politicians made it illegal for taxi cab companies to charge cheaper fares. 150 people volunteered to carpool. They had to set up an impromptu dispatch station and pickup stations. People from all across the country and the world donated to the cause, but as they say, kids, more money, more problems, more filing, sorting, and distributing money. Organizers had to keep the fire going by giving people something to believe in. They had to educate each other, make sure people understood the racist policies that held them back and the new policies that had to replace them. People had to know and learn. The boycott lasted 381 days. Effective protests are really long, kids. And if people were arrested, fundraising organizations would bail them out, like the New York-based organization called In Friendship. Now that's a great title, kids. Led by the great Ella Baker and the black gay civil rights organizer Bayard Rustin and Jewish communist lawyer Stanley Levison. More on communist lawyers in a sec, kids. A lot of this movement work was done by black women like Ella Baker, Fannie Lou Hamer, and Joanne Robinson, who helped to bring on a very young, very inexperienced, and very unwilling to listen to women, Martin Luther King Jr. All in all, kids, the Montgomery bus boycott is an example of local organizing that took a lot of people who didn't always agree, being in principled struggle with each other under a common cause. The civil rights movement was part of a very long history of black people fighting for freedom. It's part of something we don't hear about too often called the Black freedom struggle. The Black freedom struggle includes a long list